5:12 local time. USS Tripoli was already inside the strait. The sea was calm. Morning light spread in thin, hard streaks across the water, laying flat bands of silver over the surface. On the bridge, the watch moved through its routine. Inside the Combat Information Center, radar scopes cycled steadily and cleanly, tracking merchant ships, shoreline clutter, and the familiar compression of a narrow waterway that never gave warships much space to think. Then 3 tracks appeared, fast, high performance, approaching from the northeast. At first, they were only symbols on a screen, small and bright against the layered noise of the Gulf. Then the numbers started to shift. Speed, bearing, closure rate, all of it moving one way, toward Tripoli. 3 fast movers, bearing 048, closing. The report came out flat and exact. No wasted words, no raised voices. In a warship's command spaces, tone meant everything. Calm meant the process was holding. The tactical action officer leaned over the display as the tracks tightened. The range was still long, but not long enough. The lead aircraft held the center line. The other 2 moved wide, one drifting south, the other north. They were not breaking away, not wandering. They were shaping the approach into something deliberate. IFF gave nothing useful. No friendly confirmation, no routine transit profile, no immediate answer to the query. Another operator checked the air picture against known schedules and regional traffic. Nothing matched. The 3 contacts kept coming in, descending in stages. With every drop in altitude, they became harder to track against the cluttered horizon. On the bridge, Tripoli held course. That was the first test in waters like these. Not panic, not theater, but recognition, confirmation, and posture. The ship did not turn. It did not surge forward. It did not flood every compartment with alarm. It stayed disciplined while the system around it came alive. Inside CIC, the tempo changed without ever slipping into chaos. Consoles shifted to threat monitoring. Voice circuits multiplied. Bearings were repeated. Closure calculations refreshed every few seconds. And every time the numbers updated, the same truth became sharper. The aircraft were approaching too directly, too quickly, and with too much coordination to ignore. Range, 62 miles, then 57. A warning call went out on guard frequency. Standard language, clear, professional. No response. The lead track dropped lower again. That was when the geometry changed. At altitude, intent could still be masked. At low level, inside a confined waterway, fast jets no longer looked like observers. They looked like a problem with almost no time attached to it. A second warning went out. Still nothing. The operator on the air search console adjusted the gain and filtered the clutter. For a moment, the returns sharpened. 3 aircraft, tight timing, controlled separation, not random, not uncertain. Whoever was flying them knew exactly how to compress the ship's reaction time. On the bridge wing, lookouts searched the brightening eastern sky. Nothing was visible yet to the naked eye. Only haze, pale light, and an empty horizon. But inside the ship, every screen told a different story. Tripoli was not alone, and it was not blind. Data flowed between sensors, watch teams, and command stations with the cold efficiency expected of a Navy warship moving through contested water. The ship's defensive posture rose one level, then another. Not enough to provoke, enough to be ready. In the aviation spaces, alert procedures began. No rushing, no shouting, equipment checked, personnel moved, headsets on, safety lines clear. Everyone on board understood the same reality without needing it explained. In a narrow strait, with fast inbound aircraft, minutes were not generous. They were a luxury. Range, 52 miles. The 3 contacts spread wider. One stayed centered, nose pointed toward the American ship. The second widened to starboard. The third climbed slightly, then curved outward as if building an overhead angle while keeping the formation loose enough to complicate a single response. That was not a transit pattern. That was pressure. Another radio call went out, another warning, another opportunity for the approaching aircraft to identify themselves, adjust course, and turn a dangerous approach into something manageable. No reply came back. Instead, one of the tracks accelerated. Inside CIC, every eye stayed fixed on the same 3 symbols as they closed the distance mile by mile. The lead aircraft was now low enough that sea return began to interfere with clean tracking. That alone sent a message. Whoever sat in that cockpit understood exactly how to use the strait's compressed airspace and surface clutter to reduce warning time. Then came the first visual report from topside. Aircraft in sight. Seconds later, all 3 broke out of the morning glare. Dark shapes, sharp wings, fast closure, sun behind them. One jet drove straight down the ship's forward axis. The second stayed wide. The third held higher and offset, watching the entire approach unfold beneath it. No one in CIC needed to say what the picture now suggested. 3 Iranian fighter jets had found the ship, and the first one was still descending, still closing, still not turning away. 5:14 local time. By then, there was no uncertainty left. The three aircraft were fully visible. They were no longer distant radar tracks or blurred returns against shoreline clutter. They were real, fast, and closing inside a piece of water too narrow for mistakes. From Tripoli's bridge, the lead jet could now be followed through binoculars. From CIC, every turn, every descent, every shift in spacing fed into a tighter tactical picture. The geometry had become unmistakable. One fighter held the centerline, one widened to starboard. The third stayed higher and farther out, drifting into a position that gave it a broader view of the ship, the surrounding water, and any response Tripoli might make. They were not arriving as a group, they were shaping angles. Range, 2 to 4 miles. The core moved across the circuit without emotion. That was how Navy watch teams kept control when the reaction window began to collapse. No one needed dramatic language, the numbers were dramatic enough. On the bridge, Tripoli stayed on course. Its wake remained straight, its bow stayed steady. The ship did not turn away from the threat, and it did not make the kind of sudden move that would signal panic. That restraint mattered. In confined water, under direct pressure from aircraft overhead, every course change sent a message. A warship that moved too early looked unsure. A warship that moved too late risked something worse. Inside CIC, the air picture tightened again. Electro-optical sensors now had a cleaner view. Heat signatures, wing shape, tail configuration. The classification became firmer. Iranian fighters. Armed status remained unconfirmed. Intent was still undeclared. But their behavior was becoming harder and harder to dismiss as routine. Another warning call went out over guard frequency. No response. The lead jet dropped even lower. The change showed up instantly across every screen. Altitude fell away. Speed stayed high. Nose attitude remained controlled. This was not a reckless dive. It was a managed approach, cutting seconds off the ship's decision window while keeping its exact purpose suspended in that narrow space between intimidation and action. The starboard aircraft pushed wider. The higher aircraft shifted through a shallow arc, not leaving the encounter, only repositioning around it. Together, they were creating pressure from 3 directions at once. One dead ahead, one off the beam, one high and outside. For a ship moving through Hormuz, that was enough to turn a contact into a tactical problem. Possible multi-axis pressure profile. The assessment came from CIC in clipped neutral language, neither exaggerated nor softened. It did not need interpretation. The formation was no longer simply closing on Tripoli. It was arranging itself around the ship's response envelope. On the weather decks, sailors kept their eyes skyward. By now, the morning had grown brighter. Sunlight cut hard across the water, throwing glare off the chop and washing the horizon in pale brightness. Against that light, the fighters appeared and disappeared in quick, sharp flashes, dark shapes moving faster than the eye wanted to accept. Every glint off a canopy or wing made them seem closer than they had been a second earlier. The lead aircraft came lower still. Too low for comfort. Too low for any honest misunderstanding. A clean, safe pass could have been flown higher, wider, and with more obvious separation from the ship's track. This was not that. This was a boundary being approached deliberately, one step at a time, with just enough restraint to keep final intent deniable. In the aviation spaces, readiness deepened. Flight deck crews moved with control. No sprinting, no crowding, no wasted motion. Equipment was checked again. Communications stayed tight. The ship's own airborne options were being prepared. Not because Tripoli had chosen to raise the stakes, but because in encounters like this, readiness had to exist long before permission to use it ever came. Range, 1.8 miles. Then the starboard fighter accelerated. Its movement was different from the lead aircraft's disciplined inbound profile. This one cut laterally, fast and low, crossing wider off Tripoli's side as if testing how the ship handled separated threats. The higher jet held altitude just long enough to keep the formation uneven. It was a subtle adjustment, but inside CIC, the impact was immediate. More angles. More timing questions. More ways for a harmless pass to become something else. Then came the first low run, not directly over the ship, not yet. The lead fighter flattened its approach and drove in along the forward sector at an altitude low enough to force every sensor operator to take the move seriously. A faint mist of spray kicked beneath it where turbulence brushed the water. Speed remained high, nose steady, no brake left, no brake right. On the bridge, watchstanders tracked it visually. Inside CIC, operators tracked it by numbers. Both saw the same thing. The aircraft was holding the approach longer than a simple show of force required. Another warning went out. Again, silence. No call sign, no acknowledgement, no change in profile. Range, 1.24 miles. The starboard fighter tightened in. The higher aircraft began a wider curve, almost lazy at first glance, but dangerous in its timing. If the lead jet forced attention forward, the other two were positioning to stretch that attention sideways and upward. That was the pressure now forming over Tripoli. Not one threat, but one threat multiplied by uncertainty. Then one of the sensor operators said it. Possible attack geometry. No one repeated it for emphasis. No one had to. On the bridge, the captain listened, watched, and kept the ship exactly where it needed to be. Steady enough to project control, ready enough to survive the next 10 seconds if those 10 seconds turned bad. Ahead of the ship, the lead Iranian fighter was no longer making a broad pass. It was driving straight in, and now it looked less like a warning run and more like the opening line of an airstrike. 5:18 local time. That was the moment Tripoli stopped treating the encounter as a dangerous approach and started treating it as a controlled tactical event. Not panic, not a scramble, a transition. Inside the Combat Information Center, the ship's posture rose with mechanical precision. Consoles that had been tracking closure now shifted into a fuller defensive picture. The air tracks were no longer just inbound contacts. They were assigned, measured, and held inside a layered grid of time, bearing, speed, and response options. Every move the three jets made was now being captured, compared, and interpreted in real time. The lead fighter remained the central problem. Still low, still forward, still closing inside an approach profile that no longer resembled routine military transit. But the other two mattered just as much. One stayed out to starboard, forcing the ship to respect the beam. The third remained higher and farther away, holding enough altitude to watch the entire space below. Together, they were trying to do what fast aircraft always tried to do against a large ship in confined water: compress attention, divide reaction, force a mistake. Tripoli did not give them one. Track all three. Full continuity. The order was short and immediate. No target was dropped. No contact was allowed to fade into the background while the lead aircraft absorbed the ship's focus. CIC held the full pattern at once. That was where a U.S. warship became dangerous, not in noise, not in spectacle, but in discipline. Across the ship, systems came fully alive. Air search updates continued feeding the broader picture. Electro-optical sensors stayed locked on the most aggressive aircraft, extracting every detail possible from angle, heat, silhouette, and motion. Electronic warfare operators began collecting signatures from the encounter: brief emissions, intermittent sweeps, timing patterns, sensor behavior. Even if no weapon was ever launched, the aircraft were already giving away something useful: their habits, their spacing, their confidence, their doctrine. On the bridge, Tripoli still held course. That choice carried even more weight now. The ship had every reason to advertise alarm. It did not. Its wake remained even. Its bow stayed level. Anyone watching from those Iranian cockpits would see the same thing. The American ship below them was not breaking formation, not scattering its motion, not projecting confusion into the sky. That mattered, because intimidation only worked when the other side looked intimidated. In the aviation spaces, readiness tightened another step. Personnel moved into exact positions. Communications checks were completed. Safety boundaries were confirmed. A launch was not yet the point. Preparedness was. A ship like Tripoli did not need to reveal every card in the opening minute. It only needed the other side to understand that there were more cards than they could see. Lead aircraft steady inbound. Starboard aircraft tightening. High aircraft maintaining offset. The update came through in clipped sequence. Inside CIC, the tactical display now showed the pressure clearly. One jet shaping the front, one testing lateral space, one preserving altitude and perspective. The formation was coordinated enough to matter, yet restrained enough to avoid an openly hostile act. That was the edge of encounters like this. Nothing had been fired, nothing was released, nothing was launched. And still, a warship could feel the full weight of a threat. The lead aircraft made another low pass. This one was closer. Its path across the forward sector was sharp enough to force immediate recalculations at every console. Closure time, turn radius, engagement envelope, possible brake direction. Even if the aircraft carried nothing, the move had to be treated with full seriousness. At that altitude and speed, there would be no comfortable gap between intent and consequence. But now the balance had shifted. The jet was no longer the only side doing the measuring. Every second it stayed close, Tripoli learned more. Sensor behavior, approach discipline, altitude control, time spent inside specific arcs. Whether the pilot relied on speed, surprise, or sheer proximity. Whether the second and third aircraft were acting independently or moving in response to the lead. This was no longer just a ship under pressure. It was also a ship building a pattern. The starboard fighter came lower. Not as low as the lead, not yet, but low enough to reinforce the message. It was not there for safety. It was there to stretch the ship's attention sideways, to force focus across two planes at once. Above them, the third aircraft shifted again. A small adjustment. Subtle. but enough to suggest support, oversight, or simply an effort to keep the American crew looking in three directions at once. Still, Tripoli did not flinch. No erratic maneuver, no rushed escalation, only visible readiness. On deck and inside the island, that readiness showed itself in quiet ways. Crews at station, sensors fixed, timing compressed, procedures already completed before the next order even had to be spoken. This was what control looked like aboard a U.S. Navy warship. Not loud, not theatrical, just complete. Then something changed. At first, it was slight, a hesitation in the pattern. The lead jet remained aggressive, but the formation behind it lost some of its earlier smoothness. The starboard aircraft adjusted a fraction late. The high aircraft widened more than before, nothing dramatic. Just enough to suggest that the pilots above had begun to understand what the ship below was showing them. They had been seen, fully, tracked in real time. And whatever advantage they had hoped to gain through speed and intimidation was starting to thin. One more low pass came off the bow. One more hard, deliberate display of pressure. But it no longer landed the same way. Because by then, the balance over Hormuz had already started to shift. The three Iranian fighters were still probing for angles, but now they knew the ship below was tracking every move just as closely in return. 5:21 local time. By then, the encounter had narrowed to one aircraft. All three Iranian fighters were still in the picture. All three still mattered. But only one now carried the full weight of the moment. The lead jet. It had been the first to descend, the first to hold the forward axis, the first to stay a little too long inside every dangerous line. Now it came in again, low, fast, direct. On Tripoli's displays, the geometry was no longer open to interpretation. The aircraft was not making a broad show of presence across the area. It was driving into a profile that forced the ship to treat every second like a threshold. The starboard fighter stayed outside, lower than before, keeping pressure on the beam. The third aircraft remained high and offset, preserving altitude and distance, watching the event unfold from above. But the center of gravity had shifted to the front. Everything now depended on what the lead pilot did next. Inside CIC, no one needed to be told that the margin was gone. Timing updates came faster. Closure windows shrank. Every estimate of intent was now measured against the same brutal reality. In confined water, against a low, fast jet, there was almost no distance between intimidation and irreversible error. Lead aircraft continuing inbound. The report crossed the circuit in a voice that stayed level, even as the numbers behind it kept tightening. On the bridge, the captain held the same outward calm he had shown since the first detection. The ship's course remained steady, no hard turn, no visible break in confidence. That mattered now more than ever. If Tripoli turned too sharply, it could feed the very escalation it was trying to control. If it reacted too late, it risked allowing the aircraft to define the moment for everyone. So the ship did what trained warships did under pressure. It stayed exact. The lead fighter dropped lower again. Not low enough to touch the sea, just low enough to turn proximity itself into pressure. Its nose remained aligned longer than before. That was what drew attention inside CIC. A routine intimidation pass would usually break earlier. A disciplined pilot making a point without pressing the final limit would widen just enough to preserve distance and keep intent ambiguous. This aircraft did neither. It held the line, it held the bow, it kept coming. Possible hostile intent if profile continues. No one inside CIC raised their voice after that. No one needed to. The phrase carried everything required. It was not a declaration. It was a boundary drawn around behavior. Continue this, stay on this angle, remain inside this closure window, and the ship's interpretation changes. The starboard fighter tightened in response. Its movement was subtle, but dangerous. Not a rush, not a dive. A controlled inward shift that increased the burden on the ship below. Now the Americans had one aircraft pressing the bow, another edging closer off the side, while the third remained high enough to monitor the full reaction arc. It was a classic pressure stack. Front, flank, overwatch, designed to stretch attention and compress decision time. But even then, Tripoli did not fracture. Track continuity stayed clean. Sensor lock remained stable. Electronic surveillance continued extracting pieces from the encounter, one brief signal at a time. If the pilots above believed speed and aggression alone could create superiority, they were already learning the opposite lesson. The closer they came, the more they revealed. Then the lead fighter pushed one step further. It came down the forward sector at a range and altitude no professional warship could dismiss. From the bridge, the aircraft looked larger now. No longer just a sharp silhouette against the sun, but a machine with shape, control surfaces, and unmistakable intent. From CIC, the closure numbers compressed into the kind of timeline that left no room for comfort. Seconds, not many. Maintain readiness. The order moved through the ship with the same cold precision as everything that had come before it. No panic, no drama, only the understanding that the next change in the aircraft's flight path might decide whether the morning ended as a confrontation or as something far more difficult to control. Above the strait, the lead jet kept pressing. At this distance, bravado and miscalculation were separated by less than a second. Its nose stayed steady, its altitude remained low. The aircraft now seemed determined to prove that Tripoli would surrender the emotional center of the encounter, that a U.S. warship confined in narrow water would show hesitation under an aggressive run from the air. Then the rhythm broke. Not with a shot, not with an explosion, with a realization. It appeared first in the timing. The lead aircraft held its line a fraction too long. Then came a correction. Small at first, then sharper. The kind of adjustment a pilot made after understanding he had come closer than intended and was running out of safe geometry. Behind it, the starboard jet shifted too, no longer moving with quite the same clean confidence as before. Above them, the third fighter widened its arc. For the first time that morning, the formation looked reactive rather than dominant. The lead jet had pushed too far into the ship's forward picture to preserve the easy illusion of control. Continue for 1 second more, and the encounter risked entering a zone neither side could manage cleanly. Break now, and the intimidation run would lose its force. The pilot broke hard. The fighters snapped away from Tripoli's bow in a violent turn, climbing just enough to clear their own danger while leaving behind a moment that hung over the ship like the echo of a weapon never used. The starboard aircraft peeled wider, almost at once. The third, still higher, moved out with them. No missile had left a rail, no gun had spoken. But no one aboard Tripoli could mistake what had just happened for a routine pass. The strike never came. And yet, in those last seconds over Hormuz, it had come close enough for everyone involved to see exactly where the line was, and exactly how near one pilot had flown to crossing it. 5:24 local time. The break came fast. One moment, the lead Iranian fighter was pulling hard away from Tripoli's bow, banking out of the most dangerous geometry of the morning. The next, the rest of the formation was moving with it. The starboard aircraft widened first, abandoning the tight lateral pressure it had built along the ship's beam. The third jet, still higher and farther out, rolled into a broader arc and began drifting away from the encounter entirely. Just like that, the shape over the strait began to change. Not instantly, not cleanly, but enough. Inside the Combat Information Center, no one confused movement with safety. All three tracks remained held. All three remained measured. Altitude, heading, turn rate, separation. The ship did not relax simply because the aircraft had turned away. It watched the withdrawal the same way it had watched the approach. With discipline, continuity, and the understanding that in waters like Hormuz, a retreat could reverse just as quickly as an attack profile. Lead aircraft opening range. The report crossed the circuit in the same calm voice that had followed the crisis from the first detection. It sounded almost ordinary. That was the point. Professional crews did not celebrate the moment danger stepped back. They confirmed it, logged it, and stayed ready in case it returned. On the bridge, Tripoli remained exactly what it had been through the entire encounter. Steady. Its bow still pointed down the transit lane. Its wake still ran straight through the narrow water. The ship had not turned to chase the aircraft. It had not surged forward to dramatize control. It had not tried to turn a defensive success into a visual performance. It simply held the sea. That was enough. Across the ship, systems remained fully active as the range widened. Radar continued painting the three fighters as they pulled away. Electro-optical sensors held them until distance, and light began flattening detail back into shape. Electronic warfare teams continued recording emissions and timing behavior, building a more complete picture of what the morning had produced. And the morning had produced more than survival. The three jets had come close enough, stayed long enough, and maneuvered aggressively enough to leave behind something every warship valued: a pattern. How they approached, how they separated, which aircraft pressed hardest, which one held altitude, how they shifted when the ship did not flinch. How quickly their confidence changed once it became clear that Tripoli was not a passive object in the water, but a fully integrated combat platform measuring every second of the encounter back at them. For the pilots above, it had been a show of force. For the ship below, it had also become a collection event. The lead aircraft widened farther. Now the formation was no longer shaped around Tripoli. It was shaped around exiting a moment it had failed to control. The pressure off the bow was gone. The beam pressure was gone. The overhead watch position dissolved with the rest. The three fighters still occupied the same sky, but they no longer owned the center of it. Tripoli did. In the aviation spaces, readiness did not disappear with the threat. Equipment remained in place. Personnel stayed exactly where procedure required. No one aboard had seen anything that morning that justified casual assumptions. The strait was still narrow. The coast was still close. The ship was still moving through one of the most compressed operating environments on Earth. There would be time later to replay the encounter in detail. For now, the only acceptable posture was control. Range increasing through 20 miles. The numbers were moving the other way now. For the first time since 512, the clock and the geometry were giving the ship something back. Space. Not much. Enough. Above the horizon, the Iranian fighters continued outward, preserving just enough discipline in their withdrawal to maintain appearances. They did not scatter. They did not run wildly. They turned away like aircraft that wanted the morning remembered as deliberate. But intent was no longer theirs alone to define. Too much had already been seen. Too much had already been captured. Aboard Tripoli, recordings were being preserved. Sensor histories were under review. Timeline markers were already taking shape in the background of the watch. Bearings, ranges, altitude changes, low passes, silence on guard frequency, the final dangerous inbound run, the hard break away from the bow. Every second mattered. Not because shots had been fired, because they had not. That was what made the encounter significant. No missile trail had cut across the strait, no defensive system had opened fire, no burning wreckage marked the water, and still, everyone involved had come close enough to the edge to understand how little it would have taken to change the ending. One more second on the same line, a slightly later break, a sharper reaction from the ship, a worse decision in one cockpit. That was all it would have taken. But that was not what happened. What happened instead was simpler, colder, and in some ways more revealing. 3 Iranian fighter jets pressed a U.S. warship inside one of the tightest waterways on Earth. USS Tripoli did not panic. It did not lose the picture. It did not surrender initiative to speed, noise, or proximity. It tracked, it measured, it endured. And when the moment came, the aircraft turned away first. By 5:30 local time, the immediate pressure had passed. The fighters were opening range. The transit continued. From the bridge, the sea looked almost unchanged. Same light, same narrow water, same steady movement south of the coast. But nothing aboard Tripoli was treating the morning as routine, because no one who had watched those 3 jets descend through the glare, shape their angles, press the bow, and then break away at the last second would call it that. In Hormuz, a battle did not have to begin to reveal who controlled the moment. That morning, the answer came without a shot. USS Tripoli held course, and the sky stepped back.